Welcome back to Bisrat for Africa. I'm joined today by a new friend of mine, Dan Karanja, who is originally from Kenya, originally from here on the continent of Africa, but he's currently residing in the US. That's where he works. And he's somebody who loves Jesus Christ. That's the most important thing you need to know about him. But he's also somebody who loves information, he does research, and he's somebody who's trying to engage the culture. And today we're going to be looking at the topic of the failures of the missionaries. A lot of the times, we always have two extremes when it comes to the missionaries. On one side, people want to praise the missionaries for the great things that they've done. You know, they've built schools, built hospitals, and all those sort of good things that we need to acknowledge. But at the same time, we can praise them for those things without actually elevating them to a godlike status where everything it was perfect, because we all know that not everything is always perfect, and it's human beings, and if it's human beings, there are always failures that come with being human. And so also the other side of it is that we can criticize them and say, these are the failures, these are the mistakes. And I think it's something for us as the church as well, that we can learn from those mistakes when we are seeking to preach the gospel, reach out to people, especially from a different culture. How should we do it in a way that glorifies God, but at the same time elevates the people that we're trying to reach? So that's what we're going to be looking at today. But Dan, won't you just introduce yourself a little bit? Just tell us who you are, what you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, my name is Daniel Karanja. As I was introduced, I'm originally from Kenya, but I live in the US today. My day-to-day working is in IT. That's how I provide for my family. But I'm a Christian and a committed Christian. And I grew up Anglican, but I am not Anglican today just because that's what I was raised in. I am a Christian, more than an Anglican, and I am a Christian out of choice, out of conviction that it is the right thing for me to be, and that's what I teach my children too. So, in brief, that's my introduction. One day I was doing research. I was going through microfilm in an archive. It's very tedious and very slow work, and I was tired. I was feeling sleepy. I was barely reading what was on the screen. But suddenly I came across this reel, uh, and the content made me wake up, and I could not believe what I was reading. And it basically it is a case file for some misbehaviors of a few missionaries, and obviously I woke up and read through the whole thing, and I could not put it out of my mind. And with regard for today, I find it important for us when we talk about Christianity, those of us who are on Christians and out to defend and do apologetics for Christianity in Africa, uh, it behooves us to acknowledge some of the mistakes and some of the wrongs and even evils that were done by missionaries. Because if we dismiss them, if we wish them away, we are doing a disservice to the history, and we allow the other side, those who are building up Christianity, to have a foothold in the argument. Because it is true, there was a number of things that were done wrong, very wrong. Some of them are evil and very difficult to read. It behooves us to know what those are and acknowledge them and not try to minimize.
Absolutely. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. And Dan is obviously going to give us a perspective from East Africa and the history in that location. Remember, our vision is for the African continent. It's Bisrat for Africa. It's not Bisrat just for South Africa. And earlier today, I posted a video as well about King Leopold and what he said to the missionaries. So if you haven't watched that one, I'll put it in the comment section for you to have a look at. But we will be looking at the whole continent and really trying to present a case for the Christian faith. So, Dan, over to you.
All right. So, as I mentioned, I was going through microfilm reels of the Anglican Church, and I came across this file with a lot of documentation about a story that is not very well known, and so that is what I would like to present today. And it's an example. It's one example of some of the wrongs that were done to Africans by
Mm.
missionaries, things that are usually brushed off or reduced or minimized when we Christians talk about the work that was done by missionaries. I
mm,
am a believer in Christianity, in Jesus Christ, and I believe in the net good that was done by missionaries. What I would
mm,
like to say before I jump into this is in any large group of people, any large group, whether you're talking of doctors, whether you're talking of drivers,
mm,
um, basketball players, whether you're talking of sailors or chefs in the kitchen, in any large group of people, there will always be, no matter how much you try, there will
mm,
always be a few really, really, really bad people.
mhm.
There will always be. There will always be mistakes done. There will always be wrongs that are done, evils that are done. You call it what you may. There will always be. So,
Mm,
because church is done by human beings. So,
mm,
unfortunately, you will find those examples in church too.
mm,
And it is our duty for us as Christians to call out uh, some of these extremes that we see. Because
mm,
I believe that while you and I can differ and agree to disagree on some peripheral issues or things that are peripheral, speaking in tongues, should I have a
mm.
beard? Should I not have a beard? Can I go to church in jeans
Christmas.
or shorts, or do I have to wear a suit? How do we baptize? Do we baptize young
Mm,
kids or do we baptize adults? We can agree to disagree on some of those things, but there are
mm.
real, real bad things that are done in the name of God and covered up, and we should always be brave enough to call that out. So this is one
Absolutely.
example. But there is unfortunately many more. And in this example, I am only going through the highlights. I will not go into some of the details. Unfortunately, this example has some sections that are very salacious, some that
Mm.
will make your blood boil, in
Stop.
anger when you read. But I'll try as much as possible to go over some of that which is not necessary to convey the point. So
Mm.
on we go. The
Yeah.
story is about, or the episode is about Bishop, the first Anglican bishop in East Africa of the Anglican Church. So his name was Bishop James Hannington. Now, James Hannington is very well known amongst those who are into missiology in the Anglican Church because he
Mm,
died as a martyr. He died in Uganda and he was killed on the orders of Kabaka Mwanga in 1885 because he
mm,
died for his faith. So that is why he is well, that is for what he is well known for. So he did die for his faith. He died going to take the gospel over to Uganda. And his death, what is sad is that his death in 1885, late 1885, was the precursor or the first, very first death among the people who died for their Christians who died for their faith in Uganda. The group is called the Uganda Martyrs. And that is a story for another day, because I believe that is a story that is a source for a lot of encouragement and a challenge for us as we get challenged today about our faith. Because those are young people who died, a lot of young people, and the reasons why they died. It actually, what people say that history rhymes, history repeats itself.
mm,
That is a case of history repeating itself, because some of the reasons why, actually, the main reason why they died is very relevant today. They died because of their resistance to homosexuality. That's
mm,
why they died, and they all died willingly. They could have chosen not to die. They could have chosen to obey the ruler of Uganda, or Buganda at the time, not Uganda, but Buganda. They could have chosen to give up religion, but they chose to. Every one of them. And the other interesting thing is that they all died after being Christians for a very short time, maybe 5 years. They were
mm,
all very young people. So there is a teaching story there. So anyway, so Bishop James Hannington, after the mission had gone on in Buganda for quite a long time, maybe
mm,
like 6 years at the time, so he was
mm,
appointed the Bishop of Buganda. At the time, it was called Equatorial East Africa. So he was sent there. When he was in preparation for going up into Buganda, so he sailed over to Zanzibar. That's where everybody, traders and missionaries and government officials, they all went through Zanzibar. So he went to
mm,
Zanzibar and he was buying supplies, organizing a caravan. At the time, there was no way to go to Buganda other than walking. So he was organizing everything. At the same time, he was overseeing the affairs of missionaries because there was a lot of missionaries around the coast. Uganda,
mm,
Zanzibar, Mombasa, what we now call Tanzania, and Malawi
mm,
too. So there was a quite a bit of missionary activity there. So he was going there and he was overseeing the affairs, taking care of many things to do as the one of the few bishops to have been there. As you can imagine, he was a busy guy. So when he went there and he was preparing now to head out into the mainland over to Buganda, so he received a letter from a fellow a missionary in what is now Tanzania. So that is the story we are going to. So the episode here will kick off with the letter that he got from the missionary. So let's go.
No problem.
So there are three important people that will feature in this story. One of them is Bishop James Huntington, the Anglican Bishop of East Africa, the very first Anglican Bishop. And by the way, there is, in the Anglican Church, there is a feast day for him every year. And there is a memorial church in England named after him. The other key person here is a lay missionary called James Tomas last. So he was a lay person, he was not ordained, but he was a missionary. He had been in Mombasa since 1876. So he had been there for almost 10 years at the time. The other key person is, the third person is Reverend John Roscoe. He was an ordained missionary, an Anglican missionary. So those are the three people there. The ordained missionary who was there for a long time, J.T. Last, who had been there for about almost 10 years, and the new arrival, James Huntington, the bishop. This took place, the episode we are discussing took place, or the series of episodes took place in 1884 to 1887. And all three people were under the employment of the missionary arm of the Anglican Church, which was called the Church Missionary Society. And I believe it still bears that name even today. And like I said, the missionary arm of the Anglican Church, in addition to the Methodists, the Baptists, and others, Seventh-day, they did a lot of great work that should not be forgotten. But at the same time, there are a few dark pages in that history. So the main events took place in what is now Tanzania. Obviously, at the time, there was no place called Tanzania, and it was near what is now the administrative capital of Tanzania, called Dodoma. So the story took place in Tanzania. The bishop was in Zanzibar, which you see there in the red arrow, and the bishop was getting ready to walk all the way up to Kampala. Now, at the time, the ruler, the Kabaka of Uganda, was very fearful of people. There had been, I don't know what you call it, there had been a prediction that the end of the Buganda kingdom will come by people coming from the east, meaning people coming from what is now Kenya. So there was a lot of fear among the people who are ruling Buganda about people coming from the east. The bishop didn't know that, so he walked from the east. Wow. So he entered Buganda from the east, and that's one reason why he was killed. There are many other reasons why he was killed, but that's the reason most given, and I believe it's a contributing reason why he was killed. So the bishop is in Zanzibar. He received a letter from someone near Dodoma, the ordained minister called Roscoe, and then the Roscoe is telling him to come to Dodoma. So Roscoe wrote a letter to him in, I believe, early 1885. He says, you know what, Bishop, and you can read the entire letter. It's in handwriting, so it's a little difficult to see. But he says, the ordained missionary writes and says, you know what, I the other day I had something terrible done by our fellow missionary. And he says there were very grave sins that were done or being done by the missionary, not just sins, but evils. And the writer of the letter regrets that my very first letter to you, my bishop, is something so negative. And it turns out that it is true. There were 11 African witnesses who came forward. They gave statements or affidavits about what they saw, what they know in person, not from hearsay. And what we are going to see is that the evils that were being reported here were minimized by the CMS, by the Anglican Church, the missionary arm, and they were excused away. And also the race of the witnesses, the Africans, who were the witnesses and the accusers, this was made prominent by the bishop. So it is the bishop who made a big deal about the race of the people who are complaining about this. Sorry. Before we dive into the meat of the documents, for those who are interested and curious to know, you can go into the CMS archives, and one of the most easiest place, the best place to read it is if you can do a Google search for Adam Matthew publications. Now, you will not be able to read them. You have to pay, and it's expensive. Usually, the best way is if you have an affiliation with a college, a theological college somewhere, they may have a subscription, and you may be able to get it that way. You can also, I mean, obviously, if you're interested, you can also pay for your own service, but it's a little steep. But that's the reference to the file, the case file that we are going to discuss.
Mm.
I got it in a microfilm reel, so that's the number of the microfilm reel. So when you open that case file, you're going to see a lot of letters and documents. And I am listing them all here. We don't have to read through every single one of them. There is no need. The story is easy to convey without doing so. But there are a series of letters. In late 1884, sorry, it's 1884, not 85, there was the initial report by Reverend Roscoe. So he said, I am told by some people, and it turns out the people who told him were African Christians, of something really terrible happening in what is now Dodoma. And then so he writes, so he hears this. On January 12th, he writes the letter to Bishop Huntington, and he tells him something really bad is going on here. At the same time, I think it was not January 12th. There was a letter from Bishop back to the headquarters in England to someone called Wigram. So we will see the content of some of these letters here, and you can see. So there is a lot of communication between the various people over in London, the headquarters, the missionary called Roscoe, and the witnesses that we see. So there is a ton of documentation about this case. It's not one of those cases where you have just a single point of view. No, we have 11 affidavits from the Africans, and they are very, very detailed. They make very difficult reading. So, in late 1884, when Roscoe hears of this, the very next day, he says he walked for many hours to go to the particular place where this took place and do his own investigation. And then on January 12th, after confirming all is true, he writes to Bishop Huntington. And he says, the stuff that I'm hearing is just terrible. One of our missionaries, a serial adulterer, as you can see. And not only is he an adulterer, he is doing the David and Uriah thing, as we will see. Basically, he was careful and manipulative enough to send the husband to the wife, to the woman he was looking for, to send the husband away, to make sure the husband is gone. As we will see, he went to the extent of having one of the husbands arrested in Zanzibar.
Sure.
So the missionary killed an infant from one of his relationships, and we'll see that story. He built secret homesteads for some of these women because there were several, not just one. And the story is amazing. It says he built the homesteads, some houses near a forest, far away from other people. And it says he would go there on a donkey at night. And he was careful. When he went there, when there was moonlight and he was on the donkey, he would be careful to ride near the trees so that people cannot see him. When you have a strong moonlight, there is a shadow so people can see you from far. So he was careful when he went there, he went on a donkey and he was riding the donkey near the edge under the tree so people cannot see him. So, and by the way, he used missionary funds, money, to build that homestead.
Sure.
He was also heavy-handed to the Africans around him. Like I mentioned, he would make false accusations about abuse by the husbands whose wives he was looking for, so that he can get you arrested and taken away for a long time. And lastly, that the fraudulent use of missionary money by this person. So the missionary that they are talking about is this guy called JT Last, James Tomas Last. So if you do a Google search, look for JT Last. You'll come across quite a few references to him. All right. And in the letter here, I highlighted in orange, you can see in the letter from Roscoe, he's telling the bishop, hey, you have to come up here and see it for yourself. And he says, if you can come for yourself, don't just send other people, come yourself, because there are some very grave charges against Mr. Last. Again, try to come yourself, for I feel you will not believe unless you hear it from the people who saw everything. So he wanted the bishop to come and hear from first-hand witnesses, not through
Mm,
hearsay, not second person. No, come over, hear from the people who told me what happened.
mm,
The and it, After a few days, without hearing anything, he writes again. He says, I hope you will come up, as there are many, many things to be seen to. There is a lot of stuff we have to take care of here. Things are bad. The bishop responds a few days later on February 4th. He says, basically, accusations such as that, such as those against whites are constantly made. They're made all the time. And
mm,
he says you can never believe such a thing on natives' testimony. So he was discounting the witnesses of Africans. And he says
mm,
over and over that allegations by Africans on such matters are expected and could not be taken at face value or with any seriousness. So
mm,
basically, in the very first response, he is dismissing everything that he was told without getting the meat of it.
mm,
In the same letter, he continues and says, because he was told that there was a child born, and the child was born out of those affairs, and the child was killed. And he says, you must insist, because there was more than one child, you must insist on the second alleged child to be shown to you alive. And he says something weird. He
mm,
says that black children, when they are born, they all look white. So it could have been a fake thing. Therefore, a dead child is no testimony. And he says, if there is the slightest hitch about producing that child, or if the child is not brought, then I will make sure that the woman who brought up the story is arrested and sent to Zanzibar for
mm,
imprisonment. And he says, then he continues to say, to tell Reverend Roscoe, don't try to prove him guilty. The missionary who is doing this. Don't try to
mm.
prove him guilty. Instead, try to clear him. You see this?
I see.
Try to clear him.
Cover it up.
Yes. And then he asked another fellow missionaries who he felt worked better with natives, which is a common thing among missionaries in those days, that so and so is better with natives and all that stuff.
Mm,
So he tells another missionary called Robert Price to investigate the matter, because as by this time, that other missionary, he has great experiences of natives cunning. And he says, well, don't be offended at my strongly believing, that this is happening. It could just
mm,
be blackmail from Africans. So this is the
mm,
bishop in response to what he had. So
mm,
let's find out a little more the content of what wrongs were done. At the same time, when Bishop responded to Roscoe, he wrote to the headquarters in London, and he said, because it happened, the offending missionary happened to be on leave in London at the time. So he
mm,
says, he writes to London, he tells them, go ahead and interview Mr. Last, the guy who is accused of all this, and
mm,
give him a chance to clear himself. You
mm,
see? So he is already assuming the guy is perfectly innocent. Without asking to hear any of the evidence, he is saying, give him the chance to clear himself. And
mm,
the bishop implies that he should be okay if Mr. Last simply said, I am innocent. We should just let the entire matter rest at that point.
mm,
And then he continued to explain to the headquarters that he suspects the entire thing to be made up by Africans for their own benefit. And so I hope and pray, according to the bishop, that he may be fully cleared. So as you can see, the bishop is assuming very, very strongly. He's working almost like the lawyer for the accused. Instead of
mm,
trying to fight justice, trying to fight the truth, he is acting like the lawyer for the accused.
mm,
And then he continues to say, I think you will find the evidence is most contradictory and all that time. But as you will see here, no, it wasn't contradictory. He had not even seen it. I don't think he had seen anything. He simply
mm,
dismissed everything based on the initial 2 letters he got from Reverend Roscoe. So this is in early 1885. So
mm,
let's dive a little more. Now, like I said, the documents are in handwriting. They are not typed. So it's not easy to read. So what I've done here is to pick and choose a few paragraphs here and there that will give you an idea of the content of the documents. Like I
mm,
said, it's very painful reading. So these are the witnesses who came up and recorded affidavits. So one of them said, as an example, when Mr. Last, the lay missionary, when he came here, so and so and Maua, another woman, came with him. So he says he came with 2 women. Mr. Last built small houses. They
mm,
was secluded near, the forest, and next to it lived a lady called Fatuma. Fatuma is a name that will features a lot in this whole story. At night,
Mm.
the women went to Dada with Mr. Last, and it says another witness says that a baby was born, and that's somewhere here. Uh, I don't know if you can see the mouse or you cannot see it. Can viewers see the mouse, or they will not be able to see my mouse?
Just put it up again. Okay, let's do it like
Yeah,
this.
but that's okay. Don't worry about it. Don't worry.
Oh, is that fine?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, don't worry. I'll continue. So near the top, if you download the document and read it carefully, you will see what it says. It said a child was born from one of these relationships, and the child lives for 6 days quite well. So meaning the child was healthy and was fine. And then on the sixth day, the child cried. Um, and when the child cried, it was with the missionary. And then the next day, the missionary gave the child medicine, and the child died immediately after. And the
Yeesh.
child was buried in the garden where the wife of the missionary himself, because he had an English wife, a British wife, was buried. It's a very sordid story. So
Yeah,
basically, you can see here it's implied that the missionary killed the baby,
yeah,
and the baby was buried right near where his own wife was buried.
yeah,
And this is another witness um, named Luke Wellington. So Luke Wellington says, you know, amongst all the other things he says, that he went on a caravan because in those days they were going in a caravan from the inland to the coast, back and forth to get supplies
mm,
and all that. So he says they went one day on a caravan, and in the caravan was a woman called Fatuma who had been the coast to be separated from her husband. So you can see
mm,
here the missionary had made sure to separate this woman from her husband. And it
mm,
says Mr. Last gave letters to the effect that her husband ill used her when they arrived at Mamoya. So basically, Mr. Last made a false accusation against Fatuma's husband in order to make sure the husband is arrested and taken away for
mm,
quite a while, which is a
mm.
damning allegation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this is another witness, and this witness says sometime after Fatuma had a child, because Fatuma did deliver a child, Mr. Last, this is a different child now. Mr. Last went and asked her for the child, saying, "If you give the child to me to kill, I'll never leave you." And it said the child was then killed.
Yeah,
All right. So this goes on and on. As I mentioned, there are 11 witness statements, 11 different people who
yeah,
all collaborate. And if you read all 11 of them, there is no contradiction whatsoever. In fact, what you get is a mountain of evidence about the evils he did. And
yeah,
that's so I just gave you three, a few
yeah.
things from three of the witnesses. So
Mm,
this was voluminous. It was all that this is all that was contained in those witness statements. And
mm,
it was not just JT Last, it was some other missionaries too. So this is another document about another missionary, and I believe it was in the same case file. And as you
mm,
can see, this is a handwriting, and it takes time to read and understand. But I'll just highlight one little thing. Uh, this is about a missionary who had been in Mombasa from 1876. So
mm,
it says here, the missionary, so he had been there for maybe almost 10 years, and then one day he suddenly left Mombasa. When he left, he wrote a letter saying, "I'm leaving," and he wrote to another missionary saying, "I'm leaving, and I have seen something towards that effect," but he didn't say
mm,
why. So the other people were kind of curious what happened. So I was curious too, and I read on in the case file, and it says about this missionary called Hanford that this was a letter from a fellow missionary in Mombasa. So it said Mr. Hanford was sinful with native women. And this began before he was married. So before Hanford was married.
mm,
And while he was staying at Mombasa, he was suffering from acute gonorrhea. So this is a school teacher. I think he was a headmaster. We would call him a headmaster today. So he was a school teacher, and it contains this fact. And it says, the missionary says, he came to know this because he was told by the chemist. I mean, this was before there was privacy about medical information. So the
mm,
chemist told this missionary, "Hey, this friend of yours, this co-worker of yours called Hanford, he's getting medicine for STDs.
Sure.
And so the missionary says, this guy is suffering from an STD, and it is certain that he was sinful with 2 or 3 women, one of whom was a student of Wakefield, so another missionary there, nothing to do with Hanford. Um, so as you can see here from this letter alone, you'll see there is this ordained missionary called Hanford, a school teacher who was teaching in school at Mombasa, and he was getting medication for STD, and he was a school teacher. And it continues to explain a little more what he was doing. And what it does not say here in this letter is this missionary called Hanford had sent away his wife to South Africa. And he had sent his wife to South Africa on the allegation that, or the reason he gave is that the wife was feeling unwell. So he sent his wife and kids over to South Africa in order for him to be left to do this. So this is all material you get from the missionary archives themselves. These are not accusations from the newspaper. These are not hearsay from the villagers. No, this is from the missionaries' own archives and from
Yeah.
fellow missionaries themselves.
Yeah, that's wild.
So we don't have to go through the details of it because, like I said, it can make you angry and very upset. So you wonder, how did this conclude? So initially, when Mr. Last, when he was in the UK, when this was brought to his knowledge about the accusations, he denied everything. And you can see the letter where he denies everything. He says, I didn't do anything. These are just false accusations. Some people don't like me and all that. He says, I didn't do it. And then after a little while, he seems to have had a change of mind and he admits guilt. And the letter where he admits guilt is interesting because he says, guys, telling the missionary headquarters, don't crush me. Crush is the actual word he used. Don't crush me to the ground. And please don't publicize this information. And you know why he was saying don't publicize the information? He tells you. He says, don't publish it, don't publicize it, because it'll make my poor mom sick and she will die. If my mom hears about this, she will die. So he was dismissed. So he said, please, 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 don't publicize this. Just let me resign. So he was allowed to resign, and the matter was just washed away. Nothing else. Yeah. So guess what? Mr. Last, 2 years later, he was back in Zanzibar. This time, he was employed by the Royal Geographical Society. And then after a while, he was employed by the colonial administration as a civil servant. And it makes you wonder, because we don't hear much about his personal life after that, after he left the missionary employment. It makes you wonder what other evils he did. It really does. After a while, when he changed his mind and admitted guilt, then one more time he had a change of mind and he began complaining and saying, no, he was not guilty of anything. And if you read the letter, he's looking for the other fellow missionary, the one who accused him, Roscoe. He's looking for him to fight, to confront him physically. Yeah. So he's really angry. He's really angry at that point. So my point is this. Here you have a case of real terrible things done by a missionary. They are brought to the knowledge of the bishop immediately, at the time. This is not 2, 5, 10 years, 20 years later. No, at the time. This was brought to the knowledge of the bishop, who was right there in East Africa. This was also brought to the knowledge of the headquarters. So everybody knew up the chain, from the very top all the way to the fellow missionaries. Everybody knew about it. And yet, he was simply allowed to resign. And you know, the other sad thing about this case, in all the documentation that exists about the case, there is not a single word from the missionaries, from the bishop, from the headquarters. There is not a single word of concern about the harm that was done to the Africans. None.
Sure. It was more about protecting their own.
Correct. Now, we will not go into many other examples because there is no point. I think the point is made. But there's many more of real evil wrongs done by missionaries to Africans. So one of them, like I mentioned, is by Reverend John William Hanford, who was an ordained minister. He sent his wife called Agnes to South Africa, saying that the wife was not feeling well. And you can see, we just saw that the real reason why he did so. There was another missionary called Stuart Watt, also in what is now Tanzania. This missionary flogged their servant to death in 1888, saying that the servant had stolen some goods. So he flogged that guy to death.
Mm.
Again, guess what happened? He was simply allowed to resign and leave. When he left, a few years later, like 5 years later, he was back in Kenya, this time in Kenya, and he was back this time as an independent missionary. And as you can see here, this is a common story. I mean, these are human
Mm.
beings. It's kind of the
Mm.
same thing we see today. So when someone has a problem with the denomination that ordained him, or accused of wrongdoing, sometimes they just leave and they come back with a different ordination, or they come up
Yeah.
with as an independent priest. There was a case, a very well documented case of land dispossession by the Presbyterians near Nairobi, and in this case, that information is contained in their own archives. This is not
Mm.
in the government archives. This is not by Africans telling the story. No, it's there in their own archives.
They're
So
saying it.
yes, yeah. So there is a place called Kikuyu, a town called Kikuyu, and that's the
Mm.
head. That's the oldest. That's one of the oldest Presbyterian churches
Check it.
in Kenya. One of the very very oldest. And the land that the church is built on, some of that land was taken away illegally from Africans around there. So that information is contained in there because eventually, after like a decade or so, people began complaining about how the land was taken. And so the missionary arm was forced to respond and to do their own investigation. The government was involved. So all that documentation is contained in their own archives and also in government archives. So you can see
Mm.
that the missionaries, where it was not beneath them to take land by force from Africans. There was also a curious case of another missionary called Charles Stokes. Charles Stokes was a lay missionary also in East Africa, an Anglican missionary too. Uh,
Mm.
This is different from the others that we have read because I believe Charles Stokes was one of those people who were way ahead of his time, way ahead of his fellow missionaries, and way ahead of other people. Because when Charles Stokes, his wife died, his English wife died during childbirth. When the wife died, he made a very brave decision. He decided to marry an African woman, and as
Mm.
you can imagine, at that time, it was
Taboo.
scandalous. It was
Mm.
scandalous, taboo of the highest order.
Mm.
What Charles Stokes did when he married, it says there in the documentation, he himself writes to the missionary headquarters, telling them, you know what, I have decided you will hear about my marriage from me myself. You will not hear from other people; it will be from me. I have married
Mm.
an African woman. And he describes her in very loving words, the woman he
Mm.
married. So it was scandalous, and he said, "You know what? I'm going to save you a lot of agony. I'm going to resign because he knew he would be kicked out anyway, even though he did
Mm.
nothing wrong." Because he went to Zanzibar and he had an official marriage. It was officially registered. There was witnesses in the wedding because it was not officially he was not officially disallowed from marrying Africans. So he said, I'm not doing anything wrong. Obviously, as you can imagine, the headquarters were not happy. Um, and so they complained about it. But he writes a very interesting letter to them. He says, you guys there in London, you do not know the suffering I have gone through because he brought his British wife home to East Africa, but she got sick immediately after coming. She got sick from diseases. In those days, it was very common
Mm.
for new people to die from malaria and other tropical diseases. So she died from diseases. So he says, you have no idea the trouble I went through, the anguish I went through with my English wife. And so I
Mm.
have decided that I will marry an African woman. So the way other missionaries treated him was like a pariah. Because, by the way, he didn't
Mm.
run away. He didn't go back to Europe. No, he stayed in Africa. He stayed in the area to continue working. And by the way, he continued working for the missionary, but this time as what we would now call a contractor. So he was not officially
Mm.
their employee,
Okay.
but he was doing work for them.
Okay.
So he stayed there and he did work for them. But the way they treated him, because of the marrying an African, it's just terrible. It's pure
Mm.
racism, nothing less. And
Mm.
the sad thing, as I conclude, when Charles Stokes died, in his will, most of his wealth, almost everything he owned, guess who he left it to? It was to the Anglican missionaries,
Mm.
the same people who treated him terribly. They are the same ones who he left most of the money to. And there's many other cases. I don't know if you're familiar with the bishop called Samuel Ajayi Crowther from
Mm-mm.
Nigeria.
Ah.
So he is the first African bishop in the Anglican tradition. He was ordained in 1864. When he was ordained,
Oh, I think I know him. Yeah, I know him.
and he was sent back to Nigeria, to East Africa, to West Africa. The other fellow missionaries, the white missionaries, they refused to work under him because he was African. There is also the case of William Jones. William Jones was in East Africa, and he was also a missionary. He was originally, I think, from Malawi. He was a freed slave. That's why we don't see his African name. He was at that time, when you are a freed slave, they used to send some of them over to India. So into India, he was very well educated. So when he came back to East Africa, he was one of the most better educated Africans around there. So the treatment of him, it was bad, and it was all because of his own race. And so there's many other stories. I can go on and on. And so I
Wow.
believe that's the last slide that I had, and I believe we can see a good example of something really wrong that was done by missionaries, and it was all because of race, nothing else. By the way, about William Jones, let me tell you what happened. One of the sad things that was done to him. Um, he was asking, because he was officially an employee, a missionary of the Anglican missionaries. So one time, his house was destroyed in a hurricane or something. I don't remember. And so he was looking for just like any other missionaries, he was looking for the missionaries to help him repair the house. And he was looking for a roof for his house. And one of the fellow missionaries there, right there with him, they write in a letter, why is William Jones getting a metal roof? Why can't he have, like other Africans, why can't he have a grass roof, grass thatching?
Sure.
And it says that, why can't he have a grass thatching like other Africans?
Yeah.
So you can clearly see they never counted him as one of them. No way. They always saw him as an African first before a Christian.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Yeah. So I could go on and on, but I don't think there's any point, especially because those stories
Well,
are
I
so
think that's
painful.
very good stuff. Yeah, very good stuff. And maybe you can tell us a little bit what is coming up next, building up from this topic in East Africa. We will
Okay.
have Dan back again to share a bit more, about the East African experience. We always focus in the South African side of things, but he's going to give us a bit of a perspective from that side. So what's up next?
All right. So what I would like to do is to discuss or to answer some specific questions that are put forth, or specific accusations that are put forth against missionaries, and I would like to take them one by one per episode and give well thought out and documented response. For example, are missionaries agents of colonialism? One, is Christianity a white man's religion? Did missionaries coordinate and collude with the colonial agents when they came over to East Africa? So those are some of the questions I would like to answer, and there is many more, but maybe we can begin with some of those,
Let's start with
and
those.
we'll
Yeah.
see what happens. My goal is always to provide documentation, and always to provide references, and to avoid something that's very common in apologetics, of one-liners, having one-liner responses,
Yeah.
using cliches,
Yeah.
using ad hominems, making it personal, that sort of thing. No, it doesn't have to
Yeah.
be personal.
Absolutely.
I should be able to defend my faith properly without getting angry, without belittling someone else. I should be able to do that. So that is what I seek to do. So we will be in touch, and we'll do this again.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for watching. And if you have more questions on this topic, please feel free to write something in the comment section, and maybe something that we can deal with before we start our next video whenever we meet up again. But thank you so much for watching. We'll see you guys on the next video.